Alright, so let's get started with learning about the rule of the square. Alright, so first of all, does everybody remember what opposition was? If you don't, you can raise your hand and I'll answer. Alright, nice. So everybody remembers what opposition is. So now, if by the way, if you ever have a question about like something we're learning in class, you could always just go to the YouTube videos on the channel, and they should all be there. And since you guys are the intermediate class, you guys should watch the intermediate videos because those are like the more advanced ones. Alright, so let me get started by showing an example of the rule of the square. Alright, so what the rule of the square is actually, let me edit this position. Now the rule of the square occurs when it's a pawn endgame. It's something when you have a pawn endgame, and it's when the pawns are on the last two files, so the A file and the H file. Alright? This is the only time the rule of the square is possible. If the pawn, let's say this pawn, instead of being on the A file, it was over here, and the rule of the square doesn't really matter. Alright? So instead, we're going to have the rule of the square is only going to be on the last two files of the board, okay? And also, it's most of the time it's going to be when your king is super far away from your pawn and it can't defend it, alright? So that's another like requirement, okay? So, now what the rule of the square is basically if black can stop the white pawn from queening in time. And so basically, if black can get over here before the white pawn can get to A8 and turn into a queen, then that like relationship is what the rule of the square is about, okay? So let's start with what is the square, okay? So the square of the pawn is basically how many squares it takes for the pawn to the promotion square, right? The promotion square is where the pawn will turn into a queen, bishop, rook, or knight. So how far it is from the promotion square, and after that, then you count the same amount of steps to the side. So let me show you how that looks like, alright? This pawn is on A4, okay? Now it's 1, 2, 3, 4 squares away from queening, okay? So now if it's 4 squares away from queening, we count 4 squares to the left, okay? Or to the right. And let's say you were on the H file, then you'd count 4 squares to the right, okay? Just delete this. Okay. Now count 4 squares to the right, and then you fill out the square. So 4 squares up again, and now the square is completed, right? Now if you'll notice, this entire like box basically, or the square, is something that is like basically how you can tell if black can stop you from queening, alright? Now, so basically here, what happens is, if the black king can get into the square, so you see the square, if the black king can get anywhere in here, so any of these squares, then black can stop the white pawn from queening, alright? So black needs to move somewhere anywhere in here, alright? It could be in any square. It could be here, 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 here. Doesn't really matter. As long as the black king is anywhere near here in the square, it can stop the white pawn from queening. And why is that important? So in this case, if it's white to play, okay? And now we have this square, right? This is how big the square is. Now let's say the best move would obviously be to push the pawn, right? Because then you get closer to queening. Let's say white plays something like king to g1, alright? Now this is obviously a really bad move, but it's just for an example purpose. In that tournament, I would expect you guys to just push the pawn, get a queen, and we already learned how to checkmate with the queen and king, so it should be pretty easy. So here, what we're going to do is, we played king to g1. This is a bad move, but let's think about it from black's perspective now. Now, if this is the square, then black needs to get his king into the square, right? Somewhere in here. So where should the black king move if he wants to get inside the square of the pawn? Rakesh?
You should move to e4.
Exactly. Yeah. He has to move to e4, right? Now, now the king is within the square. Okay? So now, let's say we move the king again. Now, since white is or black is already in the square, he can stop the pawn. Actually, instead of king f2, let's say white pushes, okay? Pushes the pawn. Now, this is something important about the rule of the square. If, as the pawn keeps on moving up the board, the square shrinks. So here, the square is this big, right? Now, once the pawn, wrong move, let's say the pawn goes here, then the square shrinks even more. And when it pushes, the pawn moves again, it's going to get even smaller. And smaller, it's going to cover these 4 squares. And finally, it's going to just have that square and it's going to be promoted, right? So basically, black needs to be quick. He needs to stay in the square until he can stop black's or white's pawn from queening, right? So how does that look like? Now we said that this is a bad move. Now it is black to play. So say the black king went in the square, right? Now something important for black, if you're ever in the square, you'll always be able to get in the square once once the opponent's pawn moves, alright? So now black was in the square, right? He got into e4. Now when the pawn pushes, now where should the black king go to get into the square? Remember, the square is how far the pawn is from queening, and then you have to count that same number of steps to the right, and then fill out the square and see if the black king can land in any one of those squares. Alright, and I'll give you like a minute. I think we'll wait until 5:45, and then I'm gonna ask everyone to give an answer. All right? All right. So let's see what everyone says. All right. Let's start with Rakesh. Where should the black king move?
To d5.
Okay. So Rakesh says the black king should move to d5. How about Jetin?
The black king should move to e5.
D or E?
E.
E5? Okay. So we have E5 and D5. How about Sigo? All right. Maybe we'll come back to you. And Talha? Where should the black king move to get in the square. Jeten, yeah? You have a question?
Can I change my answer?
Yeah, sure.
I would move it to D4.
Alright, D4. Okay. Alright, Tala, do you have an answer or no? Okay, that's fine. So, in this case, the correct move is king to d5 to stay in the square. Alright? So first let's look at the square. Alright? Let's count where the square is. Alright? So now since the pawn is here, it is 1, 2, 3 squares away from queening. Right? The other side, it is 1, 2, 3 squares. And you fill out the square. Remember, the amount you count to the right or left then it's the same amount that it is to queening. So since we're 3 squares away from queening, we go 3 squares to the right. Now we have the square. Now, the king basically needs to get in one of these squares. Now, which square can the king move to? Now, definitely that the only one it can go to is king to d5. Alright? The problem with king to d4 is it's not in the square. And now when the pawn pushes, the king is going to be chasing from behind. And white is going to get the queen before black is able to stop the white pawn, right? So now we don't want that to happen. So instead, let's go back. So, 1 second. Alright, so now we're going to play king to d5. Now let's say the pawn pushes again. We're going to, again, count the square, and it looks like this. So the king's going to go here. Pawn pushes. We move our king closer. Now when the pawn queens, what do? What's the best move for black here? Looks like they got the queen. Rakesh.
Kill the queen.
Alright, and Sigo?
Um, king to A8.
Exactly, both of you are right. Nice. So, this queen, even though it is a really powerful and strong queen, it's not being defended by anything. That means that the king can take it. And now, when there's only 2 kings, it is a draw. Shown right here, it says draw. 1 over 2 dash 1 over 2 means draw. Alright? So now that is how the rule of the square worked. You saw that if once the black king was able to get in the square, we were always able to stop the pawn, right? Now let's look at another example where it is the same thing, alright? Let's go here. Okay, now in this case, it is okay, let's just white played this, okay? Now it is black to play, and where should you move this king to get in the square of the pawn and stop it from queening? So, it's good that you already have the answer, but we're gonna wait until 5:52, and then I'm gonna ask everyone to answer. All right? So remember, to find the square, you have to count how many squares it is until queening, count the same to the right, and then fill out the square and see where the king can go to enter that square. All right? So at 5:52, I'll be asking everyone for an answer. All right. In the meantime, I'm gonna go get some water. Alright, I'm back. So, let's go around and see what you guys have come up with, alright? So let's start with Jutton. Where would you move the black king to get in the square?
D8.
Alright, so Jutton says to d8. Next, let's go to Sigo.
King to D8. Same thing.
Alright, and Rakesh. Okay, so Rakesh, where would you move the black king to get in the square?
I don't have any answer.
Okay, that's fine. And Talha?
I don't have an answer.
Alright, so basically, in this, yeah, so both of you are correct. So good job, Jutton and Sigo. So yeah, this square, if you put the king there, it will be in the square. So let's see why. So this is the square, right? So this pawn, and then 1, 2, 3 squares away from queening. So you go 3 squares to the side, and you fill out the square. Now, if you'll notice, the king, it can move here, right? That's one option. Alright, but where else can the king move to get in the square? It's two other options. Sigo?
Um, D7 and D6.
Nice, you got both of them. Yeah, the king can move to either of these locations too, right? Talha, did you have a question? Alright. So yeah, the king can move to either of these squares and it will still be in the square of the pawn. Alright? And let's say you just go here, for example. Pawn pushes. Squares this. So let's say you go here. You could go here or here. So you go here. The pawn pushes. And now obviously we can't go here because the pawn is defending that square, but we can go here. One new queens, we can take. And now it is again a draw, right? So now, if the king can't get into the square on the first move, it will never be able to catch up, right? So it's basically a like one or the other. If it can get in the square on the first move, then it'll be fine. You can stop the queen. But if you can't on the first move, you'll never be able to stop the queen. So like let's look at that, alright? Now we saw that king f2, I said is a bad move, right? You should always be trying to push your pawn. So let's say we do push our pawn this time with a6, alright? Now, how big is the square? We have 2 squares up, so we go 2 squares to the side. So this is the square. Now, it's not possible for the king to jump, right? It can't jump over here. So that means that this king cannot stop the pawn because it can't get in the square on the first move. This is the square. The king can only go here. Can't be in the square. That means when the pawn pushes again, this is the square, right? And the king cannot jump, so it just goes here. And we got a queen before the black king got there. That means then now we'll be able to easily win this, right? We all know how to checkmate with a queen and a king versus a king. And if you ever forget any of this, you can always just go back and watch the YouTube videos. Alright? Nice. So this was the rule of the square, okay? Now, I want to quickly move on to our next thing because we don't have a lot of time left. And now what we're going to do is we are going to look at the middle game. Alright? So now we've looked at the opening, we learned about the opening principles. We've looked pretty in depth at the end game. We've learned about pawn endgames, we learned how to checkmate with an extra queen, an extra rook, and an extra 2 rooks, right? But we haven't talked a lot about the middle game, alright? It's because the middle game is usually a more complicated part of chess. It's the one where like you're gonna need to have like a lot of knowledge and like theories basically like the best moves possible, I guess. And you're gonna need to know a lot of this in order to get really good at the middle game. But for now, what we can do is just like a basics, a run through of the middle game, the different aspects of the middle game, what you can do, and stuff like that, right? So in chess, we know that the goal of the game is to checkmate, right? So you can either checkmate or your opponent can resign, right? Those are the two ways to win, okay? Now, usually checkmating happens in the end game, right? Like we saw right now, or we saw at the beginning of this year, I guess. But we were looking at how to checkmate with a queen, two rooks, and one rook, right? We know how to checkmate with those in the endgame. Because in the endgame, it's the easiest to checkmate. There's very little pieces, and you can just, maneuver a lot. You can move your pieces around, I guess. Now, in the middle game, it is also possible to checkmate. And that is what we're going to look at first, okay? So let me just, quickly, move through the opening, alright? Uh, Playing a bunch of moves. Actually, wait, let me try something. Now you don't really need to worry about like what's happening here. So, okay, so all of this doesn't really matter right now. Okay. Alright, let's look at this position, okay? Now, up until now, it's been a pretty normal opening, right? Both sides got to castle. We developed our pieces, right? All these pieces are developed. And we got our rook to attack. We got our pawn break. We got our nice pawn center. Remember, we talked about a pawn center being good because you control a lot of space. And if you have a lot of space, then you can do a lot more stuff, right? Now we have space. We have developed pieces, right? And we have a safe king. So this, if you have all of this, this is a time that you know that it's a time to attack, okay? Now, in chess, an attack is when you just use your pieces and your pawns to go after the opponent's king, right? Just hunt it down, basically. Now, usually it's pretty difficult because when they castle, they have this like wall of pieces, right? Surrounding the king, protecting it. But basically the whole point is you have to try and break down this wall and checkmate the king. Now, an attack, very like most often in chess, you use an attack to try and get an advantage, and you usually don't end up checkmating your opponent. You usually end up winning like a pawn, or you might end up winning like a piece or something like that, right? But usually you don't end up checkmating the opponent because they still have this entire wall of stuff around it. But basically, there is a formula to attack in chess, okay? So, number one, we want to try and remove as many defenders of the king as we can. Right now, this king is being surrounded by these pieces, right? It's usually almost impossible to get rid of the rook, but the rook doesn't really like help too much in defending, because it's just, kind of useless. But the knight is the main problem, alright? If you're trying to attack and your opponent has like a knight defending the king, it's almost impossible. But what you can do is try and get the knight out of there. So basically try and make it like run somewhere, okay? Run somewhere or you can exchange it. So exchanging it means like you give up your bishop and you get their knight, or you give up your pawn and you get their knight, something like that, okay? So now we've learned two ways to do that, okay? So one, we could exchange or we could kick the knight away. And that it could be something like this. So we push our pawn here. Now we are threatening the opponent's knight, right? They're attacking it. And since a knight's a lot more valuable than a pawn, he's not gonna let us take his knight, right? I'm gonna try and make his knight run somewhere else, alright? So if he goes here, we'll take it. He can't go here, can't go here, can't go here, can't go here. That leaves three options. Here, here, and here. The blue squares, I mean. That's where I highlighted. Okay? So, now the knight can go any one of these three squares. Alright? So let's say, just for example, he goes back here. Alright? Now, with this, what we've done is this knight is no longer in front of the king, right? Now, there's only these three pawns. Now it's much easier to attack. So you see how you had that thought process of, so this piece is defending the king, so let me get rid of that piece. Alright, so you have to think like that when you're attacking. Okay? Another criteria or like thing you need to attack is strong pieces. So like pieces that are attacking. So you see this bishop is guarding all of these squares, right? And this bishop's guarding all of these squares. When you have two bishops, you can easily attack because they're guarding. You see how this bishop, both these bishops are guarding so many squares? This is really good because you can get a really nice and strong position. All right? So now, once you have this, you can start to bring your pieces and your pawns in, all right? So, what should we do? Let's say we want to bring in our let's say we already have good pawns or good pieces. Now we want to bring in some pawns. So let's say we push this pawn, right? We're trying to get more pawns in, right? So push our pawns towards the king because if we can exchange the pawns, then the king is completely open and we can just tear it down, right? So now we want to get our pawns out there, okay? Now obviously black is going to try and defend. So in a real game, they'll probably try and, play something like this, g6, or h6 to try and defend their position, right? But for this example, let's just say that they are playing something like rook a7, okay? This is obviously a very horrible move. You're not really doing anything with your rook, but it's for the example, right? Rook a7. Now we want to continue pushing our pawns. We can push our pawns or we can start bringing in more pieces. So you can always choose, right? Talha, do you have a question?
For example, the d7 bishop can just eat that pawn.
So you're talking about it can take this pawn? Well, the problem is if the bishop takes the pawn, let's just say something like this. This pawn is defending the other pawn, so it could take. But that was a nice try. Yeah, that could in like an actual game, your opponent might try something like that, so you should be able to know how to answer. Alright, so let's just say he's playing something bad like this, right? Now, when you're attacking, you have to alternate between moving your pawns and your pieces. So here I moved a pawn, so let's say I move a piece now. In the attack, the queen is the most important piece. If you're attacking, you can't exchange a queen. So this queen cannot be lost to this queen. These two queens have to stay on the board if I want to attack. Okay, so let's say I move my queen here. Now what's special about this? Let's say the rook moves back. Here, I'm gonna give this as an exercise. So let's see, this is a pretty advanced thing, but in one move there's checkmate, okay? And I want to see if you guys can find it. So I'll give you guys until 6:08 and then we'll check back in and see if you've been able to find the checkmate in one move, alright? I'll give you a hint. It's using these two pieces. Or, sorry, it's using the queen to checkmate. 6:08. Alright, so it's 6:08, so let's see what you guys have come up with. So let's start with Rakesh.
Queen to H7.
Alright. And Seagull.
Uh, the same thing.
Okay. And Jeten.
Queen to H7.
Alright. And Talha.
I don't have an answer.
Alright.
Just
So, in this case, yeah, you guys are all right. It is queen takes h7. Now, why is this? Alright. So now the king, remember, when you're in check, there are three things you can do, right? You can capture the piece that's giving the check, you can block the check, or you can move your king away, alright? Let's think about all three. Now, can the black king capture our queen? No, right? Because this bishop over here is defending the queen. Now, since the two pieces are right next to each other, you can't block this check. It's not like you can put a piece in the middle of two squares. So you can't do that. Now let's see if the king can move. So he said it can't go here because it's defended. King can't go here because it's defended by the queen. Can't go here because of the pawn. Can't go here because of the pawn. And can't go here because of the rook. So in this case, this is checkmate because the king absolutely cannot move, cannot block, and cannot capture. So this is like a quick way that you might be able to get checkmate. So after the king castles, so we said that, okay, let's just look at the beginning position. In the beginning, the weakest square is going to be the f pawn, okay? The pawn on the f file. And why is that? So it's being defended only by the king, right? So like a lot of you might have learned this if you're like playing chess when you're young. But look at this. So this is something called the scholar's mate, okay? And basically what happens is you checkmate in 4 moves if this happens, right? So with the f pawn, if it's only being defended by the king, and if we're attacking it with 2 pieces, then we can just take it. Now this king, it's in check, can't move anywhere because it's being completely blocked. You can't capture because the bishop's defending the queen. This is like an example of like a checkmate that you could that is like really possible if your opponent doesn't know what they're doing. But most of the time this will never happen. Alright, so probably shouldn't try this in like an actual game or in the tournament. It's better if you just play normal opening principles and then you try and do an attack in the middle game. Alright, so you saw now we've been alternating our pawns and now we brought our queen. So most normally, most of your opponents probably actually won't see this, so you might be able to get away with like a trap like this. Let's say they do see it and they block. It's not like a huge like life-ending situation problem. You can just keep developing the rest of your pieces, moving your bishop out, and now you're attacking the rook. So let's say blocks, right? Then you can move your other knight. You can just keep bringing more pieces towards the king. And then eventually, you might not be able to checkmate, but most of the time you'll be able to win like a pawn. You might be able to win another piece, stuff like that. And with that, in the end game, we've learned how to checkmate, right? So now we're nearing the end of the session, so I feel like we should recap for today. So what we looked at first was we were looking at the rule of the square, right? And just go back in here. So the rule of the square where if the king can get into the square of the pawn, then it'll always be able to stop it from queening, right? But if the king can't get into the square of the pawn, right, like here, can't get into the square of the pawn on the first move, it's never able to catch up, and we're able to turn it into a queen and checkmate. Then we move to the middle game, and this is the main type of middle game that you'll see happen at your level, which is an attack. So I just wanted to show you a bit of that. So basically you do your normal opening principles, and let's say now if you're able to kick out the opponent's defending pieces of the king, right? So something like this. Then we kick the knight out there. Then we start bringing our pawns and our queen, remember? So never exchange the queen because it's the most important piece in the attack, because most of the time it's the one that's giving the checkmate. So now we have all of this, and eventually you'll be able to either checkmate or you'll maybe like win a piece or something. So like, let's say over here, right, we had here. Now this rook is trapped, it can't move, right? In this case, the knight could block, but let's say your opponent just played something bad like that. Now we're able to take, and now we have a rook and they have a bishop. Now a rook is 5 points, a bishop is 3 points. So obviously a rook is more valuable, right? So we got the more valuable piece. And that means in the end game we'll be able to use that to win the game, right? So like that, an attack can be really useful because you win material or you can quickly win the game instead of taking like a grueling amount of time winning the end game. So yeah, that's the use of an attack, right? So if does anybody have any questions about what we learned today? First of all, no. All right. So if nobody has any questions, I will see you guys at the tournament on Thursday. And by the way, this is our last class, so after the tournament, I will not be seeing you anymore until next year when I'll come back and I'll resume the club. All right. So thank you all for joining, and I'll see you at the tournament. Bye.
Bye. Thank you.
You're welcome. Bye.
Bye.